Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Importer vetting in a modern compliance environment, protecting brokers, bonds, and reputations. I'm Karen Rizzuko, president of Roanoke Insurance Group, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Importer vetting has become one of the most critical compliance responsibilities for custom brokers. With increased enforcement activity, modernized broker regulations, and heightened expectations from CBP, inadequate vetting can expose brokers to financial loss, bond exposure, and reputational risk. Today's session is meant to be practical and timely. We'll focus on real world red flags, current enforcement trends, and how both onboarding and continued vetting support compliance in today's environment. A few quick housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's webinar will run about 45 minutes, followed by a live Q&A. We'll address your questions at the end of today's presentation, but please feel free to enter the questions in as they come up. Attendees are eligible to receive one CCS, MCS, or LCB NEI credit for today's session. A recording and follow-up resources will be shared after the webinar. I'm joined today by two excellent speakers. Eric Wilsgard, who's our Regional Vice President at Roanoke Insurance Group. Eric works closely with custom brokers on importing, bonding, onboarding risks, and surety exposure, and brings a very practical, real-world perspective. Lenny Feldman, Managing Partner and Operating Committee Member at Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg. Lenny is a nationally recognized authority on customs and trade compliance and has deep insights into CBP enforcement trends and broker regulatory expectation. During today's discussion, we'll cover CBP's evolving expectations for broker diligence, financial and bond exposure tied to importer behavior, common red flags that are signal elevated importer risk, why vetting must be ongoing. You'll hear that in our presentation today. It's not a one-time thing that you should be doing. It's continued an onboarding exercise of vetting importers. I'll guide the conversation and pose questions as we move through each session, and Eric and Lenny will build on those topics from surety and legal compliance perspectives. So with that, let's get started. Thank you for joining us today. So looking at importer vetting, let's start by setting the stage for why importer vetting matters more than ever today. We're seeing, an increase in enforcement, modernized broker regulations, and higher expectations from CBP. So, Eric, from a surety perspective, what changes are you seeing that make importer vetting more critical today than it was even a few years ago?
Well, I think everybody's familiar with the 111s, that forced the POA, and that puts a little bit more responsibility on everyone on this, on all the brokers on this call. It's your responsibility now, to report omissions, errors, fraud, anything weird. There is a big obligation on your shoulders. So I guess to say it's more important than ever. It also goes with the current trend. I mean, what we're seeing with this Tariff War, everybody's busy, everybody is running around with their head cut off. It still is very, very important that things be properly vetted. It's just harder to find the time. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be continuing to do it.
Yeah, I agree, Eric. And as a follow-up, Lenny, how does weak vetting show up later in bond claims and financial exposure? Oh, you're on mute, Lenny.
Yeah, well, thanks again first for having me. Always a pleasure to be with my friends at Roanoke, and appreciate everybody who's on board and listening today. Look, when it comes to the vetting process, so key just to get it straight, get it through the straight and narrow up front, because it is only going to create those problems sooner or later. If in fact the vetting is in certain respects weak or incomplete, you might be running into situations that you're working with importers that might not be as reliable, might not be as compliant as you would have hoped or you would have expected. And when that happens, there's going to have to be adjustments that are made very, very quickly. Maybe, as we're going to be discussing today, they weren't classifying properly or valuing the merchandise properly or had wrong countries of origin. And as a result, they're going to be very surprised to find, as will you and possibly Roanoke, the surety and the underwriter, that they owe more duties. They're going to owe more than was initially anticipated. And that's going to create exposure. It's going to create bond insufficiencies, bond stacking. So I think just making sure you have a very reliable importer, that they understand what commodities they're bringing in, they're accurately describing it, they're accurately declaring it with your support as a broker. All of that up front, to me, is part of the vetting process to make sure you have those reliable parties with reliable information. Reliable parties mean reliable information, means that their financial exposure hopefully will be limited.
Yeah, that's great, Lenny. Thank you. Next slide, we're going to walk through 5 key red flag categories brokers should be thinking about. So looking at this, Lenny, before we dive into each one, how do you think CBP thinks about importer vetting overall right now? I mean, they must be concerned about it.
They're very concerned because this is really what we're calling the age of enforcement. I don't know if you remember years ago, the age of Aquarius, which maybe we had to sing that song when we were kids. Now you could use that tune to the age of enforcement. That's what we're saying at our firm. And it is this year. It is going to happen this year because the stakes have never been higher. The duties are so high now with all these tariffs we're looking at, as I call the tariff sandwich. It's just grown and grown to 3, 4, 5, 6 different layers. So that means they really need reliable importers who are providing the proper information. So they're saying, hey, look, we can't do it on our own. We need to work with the brokerage community. We need to work with the sureties, the service providers, all to help us with the vetting to make sure it's done properly. In fact, very interesting, this morning, I was on a call with leadership from Department of Homeland Security with the brokerage community, and the vetting issue came up. We spoke about the Trade Facilitation Trade Enforcement Act. We were talking about sections 114, 115, 116 that provided for that vetting, and that never really got over the finish line. And we were being asked as a brokerage community, can you give us some practical guidance, ideas as to what we should be looking for importer vetting? We really want to look at this at not only the customs level, but Department of Homeland Security level, because we think that we are dealing with some importers who we can't trust, and we'd rather have the brokers provide some validation to them up front as opposed to having to do the enforcement on the back end. So that conversation just happened a few hours ago up with one of the assistant secretaries at Homeland Security.
Yeah, that's real time. Good information.
Real time.
Yeah. Eric, do these 5 categories align with what you're seeing most often create risk for brokers?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what we kind of did here when we got into this whole, red flag webinar project we've been kind of putting together was we tried to make an outline. These are different aspects. These are different areas. Behavioral and documentation are 2 very different things. When we got together and came up with this, we decided to put it into these 5 categories. Documentation obviously is going to be kind of the first one you see. The first thing you're going to receive when you're onboarding is going to be, all of these legal documents, entity documents, all of these things. And within documentation, there's a whole plethora of other things. Financial, that's a big one. Financial is the one you're probably going to see the most interaction with us and the surety. Regulatory, obviously, Lenny's going to have a lot to say there. Behavioral, we thought that one was interesting. That is basically, these are things to look for, kind of like more of a human factor. When you're talking to somebody and they say something strange or off, or they're not being fully, forward with you, or they're keeping something hidden, or things like that, little patterns, behavioral patterns you can see in an importer, an individual. That just to look out for. But yeah, these kind of are what we came up with as the 5, categories, I guess you'd call them, of red flags.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Eric. Let's move on to the next slide then. With regards to documentation, specifically for onboarding, you briefly mentioned it, Eric. What documentation issues immediately raise concerns for you? I know, typically you would look out for things like addresses or business names. Can you give us an idea of what you're looking for and then what you see?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory. I mean, if you see one document that has one name, and believe me, this happens more often than it doesn't. You see different EIN numbers. You might see suffix EIN numbers to start off. You might see, it doesn't. You got to read through the lines on these things. And back to how busy our community, our customs broker community is. It's very easy not to see these things or not to stop and say, you know what, that's off. That's bizarre that they put this on that form and this on another. These things just start to stand out when you look at them consistently. But if you're not looking, it's onset when these mistakes are made. But a big one is inconsistent addresses. Case in point, the surety does its own detective work, obviously, right behind the scenes. Recently, they found, just by looking, and in fact, I think it was using Google Maps, it was basically, there were probably almost 50 EINs that were all tied to a single address. And it turned out it was a house. So these importers, or these bad apple, importers, they're crafty. They find ways to get this stuff in. And when you actually look and you find things like that, look what that, rock uncovered. That led to several brokers that were involved, all, doing this negligently, and then, it was discovered. But it's only by looking that you find these things. I mean, you might find it in a little what you think is small, but it opens up a Pandora's box of goings on.
Yeah, that's great, Eric. And Lenny, what kind of inconsistencies trigger, a bigger legal or compliance issue?
Sure. I think Eric mentioned some really good ones. What I usually suggest for brokers is start with your power of attorney, because that's really going to be your critical document in initially establishing that relationship and seeing if the importer's information seems to be consistent or not. And by the way, for the customs brokers here on today, make no mistake, your exercise, your responsibility of responsible supervision and control, you're required to validate the powers of attorney accordingly. Now, CBP has not specifically said, okay, this is exactly what you need to do to validate or vet, but they did provide some helpful suggestions, which hopefully all of you have our NCBFA Powers of Attorney Handbook. And in that handbook, we actually go through and we emphasize what some of those, if you will, telltale signs are of where those problems could start, what you should be looking at. Did you at least get a non-expired government issued photo ID, for example, for the individual who's granting the power of attorney? Do they have the authority? Is it just a marketing director, which, believe it or not, I saw a power of attorney one time that was provided by the director of marketing. They didn't know what they were doing. Years later, they found out that they were listed as the importer of record and never thought they were. They thought it was a DDP transaction we'll talk about later, because that official didn't even realize what they were signing. So who's signing it? Is there an inconsistency as to who should be signing? Is there inconsistency as to who they portend to be, but you go to their websites and they look to be a very different type of company? Do they have any brick and mortar, or all they have is a post office box? Maybe that sometimes does happen in this virtual world, but putting down an address and realizing that that's somebody's house, that's definitely an inconsistency I'd be concerned about. I think, Eric, you mentioned, and I think it's very key, making sure that their tax ID information, their EIN information is consistent with the Department of State at the various, in Florida, we have our Department of State registry, and which is the case throughout the country, making sure that looks appropriate as well. And even checking, if you can, through third-party entities, credit reports, DUNS number, any type of similar business identification that could exist. Any of those inconsistencies are going to be problematic as well. So there's a lot that you could be looking out for, and a lot of red flags that you could hopefully be deflagging as you go through that initial POA process.
Yeah.
The
I
deflagging
like to
term is
say-
good.
I'm
sorry,
sorry.
I had to
I like
note
to
that,
say
the
Google is
deflagging
your
term.
friend, which I think it is
Google's
still
it.
your friend. Google these
is.
company names, right? You still, that gives you a lot of information. You're collecting all this
Absolutely.
documentation here, but don't forget that piece of it.
Absolutely. We can all be detectives on Google, and
Yeah.
I encourage that.
Okay, moving to the next slide, if we could, financial behavior. It's often one of the earliest indicators of elevated risk. So, to Eric, what financial red flags do you see most often tied to importer risk or bond exposure?
Well, so financial is ongoing, as you brokers know. We're constantly requesting, reviewing. The surety at will is going to be looking at financials. This usually comes into play not initially, but soon thereafter on onboarding. What you really want to look for is the thing about this is, in our position, it's not always shared with the broker. Obviously, as you guys know, the financial information is often sent to us or to the surety. It's reviewed, and there is no, that's not something that's shared with you all. So you kind of are left in the dark oftentimes. If you are so willing, like we suggested, like Lenny suggested, Dun & Bradstreet is a great resource. You know, if you have financial concerns at the onset, if it's like listed here, one of the big ones is the banking. If it just seems unusual, if it seems like the route of the money is odd, or it's coming from overseas, or you know they are unwilling to work with X bank, or you know this financial institution has rejected them. Any things like that that I guess would be indicators where you don't really have to do any research. But as they start to ask you things, you know, these are, again, these, we're going to say the term red flags, but these are the red flags that should go up. You know, if they're being evasive, if they're, we lost our
Teresa, we
presenter.
lost the presentation. You're sharing your, there we go. Thank you.
You know, evasiveness, and this is across the board. This is also behavioral, but evasiveness. And when it comes to payment, when it comes to, how these things are being arranged, I mean, again, this is just our good judgment. And when we don't, it's easy to not do it. It's also not terribly hard to focus on this and actually let it stand out and go, wait a second, that's a little odd, you know? So the financial is ongoing, just as vetting is. Which we'll get into, but you know, it's really at the onset, I would look for bizarre ways of payment, and just the unwillingness and just that evasiveness is a big indicator something's funky with financially.
And, you know, Eric, how can brokers access some of these reports? The DNB, credit reports, S&P?
Yeah, so S&P is a really good one. The only catch with S&P is it's usually larger companies. DNB is good. It's going to give you what's called a PAYDEX score, and it's going to show. It's not perfect. It is what's input into it, but oftentimes you can catch something in DNB. It's a good resource. It'll tell you basically if a company's been paying their bills or not. Obviously a good indicator. And then, like you said, just Google. I mean, you know, you'd be amazed at what you can find. And just asking the right questions, you know.
Yeah, and that's great information. Lenny, how do financial inconsistencies connect to broader enforcement and concerns like trade-based money laundering? So trade-based laundering, how do the inconsistencies come into play?
And yeah, I think you all might remember, I think the brokerage community, import community will remember that just about, well, maybe it could have been about 10 years ago when we were kind of brushing off the CT-PAT requirements, trade-based money laundering appeared. And when I was involved in those discussions and I was on the advisory board to CBP and DHS and Treasury, said, yeah, we really want to look at trade-based money laundering and we want the trade community to be aware of it. And this is now a criteria that we're looking at because the government is very much pursuing those types of actions. And if you're involved in any of those, then you're really going to be potentially opening yourselves up to exposure to some very, very substantial consequences in cases. I think it's very useful to look at the trade-based money laundering guidance that CBP put out at that time to the CT-PAT membership. It is public. And the various key warning indicators. You know, Eric was talking about method of payment. Cash, for example, is definitely going to be a flag of some sort. Incorrect pricing. What if you're finding that the goods reported on the bill of lading or invoice and is not consistent with what you would expect as the known fair market value? An exporter bills $2 million, but actually they're exporting $2 million, but they actually export $1 million, which is $1 million less than what was billed, or vice versa. The importer pays $1 million, but actually received $2 million in goods. These are things you should be looking at that would not smell right, for example. Or they say, hey, we're going to send you $2 million in gold, but they billed $500,000 for silver and $500,000 for gold, for example. Those are some of the examples they have. The jurisdictions, is the merchandise coming from jurisdictions that seem odd, that seem to be risky, for example, that could raise or be ripe for these types of financial issues? Are the commodities inconsistent? These people deal in food products, but we see that they're dealing in technology all of a sudden. Maybe some of that could be legitimate, but not necessarily for the long haul. Or even the size or the characteristics of the shipment, the weight of it doesn't seem appropriate as well. And we saw a lot of these issues come up in the small package trade, in de minimis. And I think that now, of course, has been mainlined, as I like to say, into the regular 01 and 11 entries that a lot of brokers are dealing with, a lot of high risk commodities. Are you dealing with metals or consumer electronics or anything that involves lasers or a military application? Are the shipping routes kind of odd? Why did it go in this whole circular route along the way that you would expect it to be more direct? Or even letter of credit use or letter of credits being used in a way that are being amended or frequently extended or updated in ways that seem a bit odd. So I think looking for all of those types of issues, those warning indicators, we really need to look at that again. And the reason why I wanted to provide this re-emphasis is because now that the tariffs have never been higher, a lot of folks are looking to reroute and try to do some of these schemes to avoid, maybe it might not be trade-based money laundering, but it might be financial vetting for the importer or the transactions that they're involved in, which, as I like to say, their whole ecosystem that they're dealing with is raising issues about what they are presenting financially, not only as an importer, but as part of their supply chain.
Yeah, yeah. If it doesn't make good common sense, ask questions. I mean,
Yes.
Yep.
So moving on to the next slide, regulatory and compliance. This is where, you get to a point where onboarding really isn't enough alone. So, Lenny, what should brokers understand about importers' regulatory history when they're vetting new or existing clients?
Yeah, I think there you're really going to want to see if CBP, as I like to say, is interested in them. Are they getting a lot of liquidated damages? So they're not necessarily, again, paying timely, or their pay, what they think is owed really isn't what's owed. So that has to be adjusted. Have there been detentions and seizures, right? That's, I think, something we need to be aware of, and you should be thinking about as well. That might not be as much of a financial duty issue, but if they're involved with merchandise, and we'll, I think, be going into the high risk commodities in a minute, but if they are dealing with goods that aren't even admissible, that don't have the right licenses or permits, intellectual property issues, I think that's a real telling sign that there may be some concerns from a regulatory and compliance standpoint. So I think those issues are really critical. I also wanted to add on the regulatory and compliance piece. Well, we could talk about it some more, but transshipment, that's become a very, very big issue now, and having the proper country of origin. If we have time, I could dive into that a little bit more too.
Yeah, that would be good. I know people will be interested in hearing your take on the country of origin. It is a big topic. It's probably almost could be a presentation in and of itself.
It really could, yeah.
Yeah. And Eric, from your perspective, how does ongoing monitoring protect both the broker and the surety?
Yeah, I mean, the surety, obviously, it's a shared interest. I mean, this is a symbiotic relationship that the surety and the broker share. We have a shared interest in minimizing claims and minimizing loss. Obviously, that's the primary concern for the surety. It's shared in the sense, I mean, as a broker, you guys know very well, if you get tangled up with a bad importer, and you end up seeing that results in losses on your profile, that directly affects your loss ratio. And that can affect the big picture of your entire bond portfolio. And these things can domino and swell really fast. So, it's ever present. It's something we should constantly be doing. I think that's a point that we're kind of trying to drive home today, is this is an ongoing thing. This is something, you constantly are vetting. You may have, an importer client for 6, 7, 8 years. All of a sudden things start to go south and you're not really aware of that. You've got just a history alone is not enough, to stand on. You've got to constantly be vetting.
Yeah, Lenny, did you touch on non-resident importer at all? This might be a time where you could weigh in a little bit.
I was hoping you'd ask, and I know one of the things that we talk about is the continued vetting, right? And this is why the continued, and I have made this, I think, very clear when we said, let's talk about an importer vetting initially. Well, just because you vetted them 10 years ago, newsflash, things have changed a little bit since 10 years ago, since 2 years ago. So you really got to, what I call, revet them. And let's just look at this issue of valuation. You might have brought on new importers, or you had importers who were bringing merchandise in, formal entry and formal entry, and were involved with e-commerce de minimis, and now they've transitioned even more of their merchandise to the main line, again, the 01 and 11, and they're using these different models. You need to vet that. You need to make sure that that's being done properly from a regulatory, from a compliance standpoint. we're finding that a lot of those e-commerce traders, as well as the traditional traders, have been saying, look, that one of the ways that we want to attack, we want to minimize, we want to mitigate the tariffs is to restructure our supply chain. We're going to do DDP. So now it's going to be a third party who's going to be the importer, not us. Maybe you'll be representing that DDP importer, for example, or that non-resident importer overseas in China or Asia or Europe, wherever they may be. And you really have to be, I would just say additional vetting. You just want to go those extra steps to make sure that they understand how to classify, but in particular, how to value, because a lot of folks are trying to use the value mechanism to lower the tariffs lawfully, kind of through first sale concepts, which are very valid and I think the highest level of compliance because of all the work that you need to do for a first sale lower price transaction, but also trying just to go through a cost of goods sold in Asia, which might not be appropriate on the non-resident importer price. And related parties, very legitimate, but some folks are saying, hey, because we're related, let's artificially lower our value because we're able to do that. The parent's going to dictate that to the subsidiary. There are very specific rules and requirements for that you all should be making sure pass the red face test. And then, as I mentioned, Karen, transshipment, please look at the CT-PAD alert, illegal transshipping. It came out July 16, 2025, and then it reappeared again. Customs is sending a very clear message that they want you looking at that transshipment alert. They want you looking at their list of what CT-PAD members should do, having a strong risk assessment, for example, identifying and knowing who the suppliers are. And get this, at the end of that alert, that illegal transshipping alert, they even said that exporters need to be aware of diversion risks through transshipment trade, which are actually published by the Bureau of Industry and Security Department of Commerce. Really making sure that you're looking at the red flag indicators on the BIS website, that you know foreign customers, you're avoiding routed export transactions, or at least you're very careful with them, knowing your customers. So they actually alluded to some of these export control issues, which I thought was very telling. This is going to be a hot issue this year. We actually already had one client who was told CBP had reason to believe they were transshipping. They said, you're going to have to pay an additional 40% tariff on top of your regular tariffs because they thought it was being declared as Vietnam, but it should have been China.
Where it originated, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And we actually went back and told CBP they were wrong and it was legitimately Vietnam and won that one. But it shows CBP's already going for this newfangled 40% transshipment tariff, which we've never seen before. And we're not even sure how it's supposed to be used.
Wow. Yeah. A lot to uncover there. A lot of exposure, a lot of risk. Yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of, as we switch to the next red flag, which is high risk commodities, certain commodities obviously carry higher enforcement and financial risk. So Eric, which commodities tend to create the most exposure from a surety standpoint?
If we can go back to behavioral too. I think we might have skipped over behavioral, but right. Yeah, good. Sorry. To answer sorry, I thought we lost our place, but
that's okay. We'll go back to behavior. So from a behavioral standpoint, not all red flags, show up on paper, Eric. So, what behavioral signs tend to raise concerns about the onboarding or ongoing relationships?
So, we use this term a lot, broker hopping. It obviously because of 111s, you can file an entry in Seattle and be in Miami. So, there is always that threat of broker hopping. If you start to see somebody calls you out of the blue one day and oh, we want to move 10 boxes of this and it's worth this and we've never heard of you before, and it you got to wonder why. We've had a 7-year history with a broker over here. Why are you all of a sudden calling me? I mean, it's not too hard to identify, but it's something to definitely be mindful of. Again, back to the evasiveness. I mean, this is a behavioral trait that you can see in an individual when they're just being evasive. It can be everything Lenny was just talking about. I mean, you start asking questions, you're not getting the answers you want, or you feel like there's just things being omitted from those answers. It's time to dig a little bit deeper. I mean, this is a strong relationship that you should build over time. Every customs broker knows that. This is a long-term relationship, and you need to get to know one another. And these new, you have a brand new shipper that comes out of the woodwork you've never worked with before. You don't have any history. You don't know what to look for, which is why these relationships that you all build with these importers are so important, and why we like to see them flourish. Pushback on values, classification, all that stuff that Lenny was talking about, withholding details of the supply chain, that goes back to transshipment. I mean, if you're asking questions and you're not getting the answers, not necessarily that you want, but you're not getting the answers, it's right there. It's time to really start asking what's going on before you get that. This can happen fast. This can domino really fast. So, where you get into trouble.
Yeah, that's good. And Lenny, how do broker and importer behavioral red flags tie into the 19 CFR 111 obligations
Absolutely.
here? Yeah.
It's a tie-in not only for brokers, but also CBP is saying that's our red flag. It's kind of a red flag that the government is planting that brokers have to be aware of. So it's coming from that end. And this was part of the revamp, the modernization of Part 111. And a lot of us, including the broker community in particular, were really concerned when we saw 111.32 come into play, because that actually it required the broker to report, to provide notification to CBP if the importer client is providing false information to the point that they are asking the broker, involving the broker, to conduct fraud or any type of potential criminal activity. And if you as the broker say, I'm sorry, I cannot work with you anymore as an importer, and you separate, you have to explain to CBP why you separated. It's a little nuanced, because if you didn't separate and they said, okay, you're right, I'm going to do it the right way moving forward, you should be okay. But some brokers were concerned about over-reporting. But generally speaking, it said, hey, you as a broker really need to look for these behavioral anomalies and not only stop them in their tracks, but you also have to report them, kind of the tattletale provision. And 111.39, which has existed for decades, that was already there. That, of course, as a broker, due diligence, providing correct advice to a client, and making sure that you have that corrective action in place. CBP took it a step further and said, put that corrective action in writing. We need to show that if you found some type of anomaly, something that was an error, you have a record of that. You are memorializing that so that we know that that's there. You and the importer know that you have a record of it in case we at CBP ever need to look at it. So from that behavioral component, CBP is expecting the broker to behave in a certain way when the importer is not behaving in the proper way. So it's behavior in a triangle right there all the way around.
What about, port hopping, broker hopping, DDP trends? These are other behaviors to be, to look out for.
Yeah, I mean, some of it sometimes is legit. I'm going to start with that sometimes there are reasons why there's a real business reason to go to another port. But to tell you the truth at this point, let's really look at what's going on out there. CBP is not shy to express, excuse me, to the trade community that they have invested in AI. They've invested in ML and machine-based learning. So as the saying goes, you could run, but you cannot hide, I think, regardless of what the port is. But if they see these trends or attempts to evade based on different types, again, broker hopping or port hopping, that's definitely going to hit their radar screen sooner as opposed to later. And you as a broker need to be aware of it, that there might be something there. And I don't think that's going to last very long in this day and age of technology.
I agree. It would get picked up pretty easily, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
And going back to the high risk commodities, we can touch on that a bit. We'll go back to Eric. If you can give us some overview on what you think are the most, carry the most weight and what ones to be on the lookout for from a surety standpoint.
Yeah, so I mean, some examples are below, solar power, textile. I mean, these are all and some of these aren't the reasons you think of. Some of it is just the industry itself. Solar is a very new industry. Some of the companies are very new. Some of these are, privately funded startup type things, and it's more of a longevity of the company scenario. So, if a solar company were to come to you all of a sudden and say, we're going to bring in however many millions of dollars of solar panels, blah, blah, blah. They have no importer record or no import record. They have, that they're new to this. The company's been, you did your research and you realize that, Perfect Sun Solar Inc. has only been in business for, less than 8 months. And you start to go, okay, this is a lot of volume for somebody who's been in business for less than a year. I mean, you just kind of put the pieces together. That would be kind of your thought process for solar is like, are they going to be a company in a year? That's a big worry there. Foods, they work with other government agencies, so that this is a bigger risk just naturally. I mean, you have other agencies that are looking into this. You're paying more duty. You have the exposure is higher, and just generally high value goods. This high value goods is a red flag, especially when it comes out of nowhere. Like the example that was given earlier, somebody calling you out of the blue and all of a sudden having this huge volume of a good that they've never moved before. And another one that can play along with that is like, let's say that very company, the name of that company, back to the first slide, there's documentation. If the name is, something Trade Inc. or Trading Co. I mean, there's no specificity to what the company makes or trades or builds or sells. It's kind of one of those like, okay, you want to step back. Pharmaceuticals, I mean, for obvious reasons, I mean, some of these are just high risk commodities in general. But these listed are ones you should definitely take another look at, especially when the corresponding volumes are really high and out of the ordinary for that importer. That's a big red flag.
Yeah, and Lenny, how do anti-dumping, countervailing duties, 232 tariffs, OGA involvement, raise the stakes for brokers?
Yeah, I mean, the stakes have never been higher. I think the brokers, God bless you all, I think you're doing a really good job in trying to get these right and just trying to get the proper information, which now, as we've seen with AD/CVD, as we've seen with forced labor, now we're seeing with 232 and trade remedies, you have to really make sure that your importers are digging further back to the tiers in their supply chain to know the smelt, cast, melt, pour, for example, which you really weren't looking at in such a prevalent way just a few years ago, and making sure you have that information. You are not, in my legal opinion, and I feel very strong about this, you are not to be held to reasonable care. You are responsible supervision and control. Your importer is to be held to reasonable care. But that means when you see these risks, you as a broker are potentially at risk as well if you're not asking the right questions. I think there's at least that standard for responsible supervision and control that if something doesn't seem right, at least you got to ask. We like to joke around and say it's the bananas from Norway standard. If you have an importer that says we are going to be importing fresh grown bananas from Norway, I would really hope that or we could use Greenland if we want to get cute about it. And I'll just stop there, but just to make everyone laugh. But if you have an importer saying that that's what they're bringing in from that part of the world, Scandinavia, you have to stop and say, can I ask you more questions about that? Maybe it's banana pudding. Maybe it's banana flavored ice cream. Okay, maybe there's an answer to that. But if it's fresh bananas, you're going to have to look as a broker and say, oh, that wouldn't be responsible supervision and control for me to have it come right through. So you really have to look at what's coming in. You have to look at what's being represented, especially for these high risk commodities. Yeah, I would also say go back to the CBP priority trade issues. Remember, it's been apparel, it's been footwear, it has been AD/CVD. It's been various types of IPR issues, the trade agreements, all of those issues are key. And the partner government agencies as well, don't forget about them, because if an importer doesn't get that right, the liquidated damage claims for restricted or prohibited merchandise is going to be 3 times the value. So right there, that's going to increase the stakes and what needs to be mitigated. And a lot of times the importers are going to want to come after you and say, why didn't you tell me? You should have told me that this wasn't the way to import it. I should have done things differently. So you just want to get it right, especially with these high risk commodities, these high risk issues. And I'm going to say high risk countries as well as the third leg to that stool.
Yeah, that's good. That's good
Yeah.
to say. Yeah, countries is important as well. I agree.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Well, another topic we could probably, expand on or make a whole presentation out of is ADD and CVD. I mean,
Absolutely.
obviously that's the most discussed or talked about high risk.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we go into that one, but that's kind of obvious.
Yep. As we look to the next slide, we're going to talk about onboarding and ongoing vetting. This is, you can just leave it on slide 7 is fine, Teresa. Thank you. So Lenny, how is CBP viewing ongoing due diligence for brokers? You kind of touched upon it earlier, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, I think they're really thinking it through further. at this point than they have in the past because they're really, if you, for example, were listening at all to the COAC advisory group meeting, the Assistant Secretary from Treasury described the brokerage community as the force multiplier. They see the broker as the revenue collectors, as the boots on the ground. I don't love that, but I think it's also a compliment too. You're kind of the troops to
Yeah.
make sure if people are compliant and the enforcement occurs. That might be more than what you signed up for. But this is all a lot more than any of us ever signed up for. And the brokers are being seen as really critical to this process and to be, to an extent, that iron dome that's kind of looking at that barrier to make sure that when an importer is listed, that the broker is assisting in doing the due diligence. It shouldn't just be the broker, but again, they're looking for practical ways that the broker is able to help in managing that risk, determining that risk straight out. And I would add, Karen and Eric, maybe just a comment or question for you all. I think sometimes brokers feel, well, they've been approved for a bond. They've gone through Roanoke, they've been approved for a bond. That must mean that, oh, they've been vetted. They're financially have the wherewithal. And I don't know, Karen and Eric, is that a false assumption? Can brokers take that for what it's worth? But then again, what does that mean? 1, 2, 3 years later, is a bond increase just around the horizon? So maybe an importer should have vetted them sooner as opposed to later, as opposed to finding out from the surety, the underwriter, all of a sudden, guess what? The bond's insufficient. Should the broker have been somewhat wary of that, or should the insurance company, should the bond writer have been? And I think that dynamic is always something that brokers are questioning. Hey, if it's okay for the surety, then it's okay with me. Does my responsibility stop there or not?
Yeah, and that was my next question to Eric, so I'll throw it to Eric. So
Good.
if you want to add to that, talk a little bit about what continuous vetting really looks like, from a surety perspective and.
Yeah, I mean, and historically, when everybody had, a $50,000 bond, everything was sort of under the table or not. It's as if a lot of rocks have been lifted up. And, when you have a lot of importers who, good or bad, it was under the radar. They didn't need a $600,000-$700,000 bond. And now that all of these bonds are being rewritten from 50s to hundreds, 200s, $1 million bonds, the scrutiny is magnified. And, when you get to that, for us, it's around a $300,000 level, as a lot of is when the underwriting scrutiny starts to kick in and we start to see financials. Anything underneath that, yeah, it sort of flies under the radar for a good while, if nothing happens. But now that with all these increases, we're seeing this over and over and over. And that's why it is more work. And that's why we're pressing this. And that's why we continue to say this is ongoing. Right now, there are so many rocks being lifted, and it's a lot to go through, and it's overwhelming. But it's you catch it now when it's being exposed.
Yeah,
There's anything positive, I suppose.
I agree. We've covered a lot of ground here today, and we do want to hear from everybody. We do have some questions, Lenny and Eric. So I want to give us enough time to be able to answer some of those questions. So moving along, there's couple things, and I'm going to toggle a little bit between our chat and our Q&A, but on the chat, Lenny, this is to you, where can we get the Power of Attorney handbook?
From the National Customs Brokers Association. Just go online, order it, and I'd be happy to make sure that you get it through the NCBFAA.
I'll throw this to you, Lenny. I think when we receive the audio and slides, is it okay to share with importers?
It's okay with me if it's okay with you.
Yeah, I think we'll answer that in our distribution email to everybody. I think that'd be fine, though. It's all good information that we all should know and be able to relate to our clients. So Eric, maybe you can help answer this one. How would a broker know a client is broker hopping?
Well, there's indirect ways to figure that out, and there's direct ways. We can only expose so much on our behalf. It's not really, ethically and legally, there's only so much we can share with you with power of attorney. If not, but we can hint at things. If you see just inconsistencies, if you see they call you 1 week and then they don't call you for 2 months, but then all of a sudden there's entries. If you are the broker of record, we provide you with shipment with entry reports. Now the the BOR, any other BORs are obviously going to be hidden there. We don't share that information, but you do know that there is another broker filing entries. It just things like that, sudden broker changes, I mean, and again, just conflicting information. And there's a lot of intelligence within our industry. I mean, if you're talking to other brokers, the word gets out, I guess, so to say, and you know, the beat on the street is useful, I think, too. But yeah, it's there's no real direct way. I mean, you can look at what's been going on and look at their entry report and kind of see, but you can kind of tell sometimes. You just have that knack after a while.
Lenny, anything to add to that before I move on to the next question?
And I think that covered it well. I think I'm
Great.
good with that.
All right, great. Why are textiles considered a red flag? I have a client who imports textiles from Turkey, but haven't had any issues.
Yeah, I think textiles traditionally have been considered a priority issue for CBP because traditionally they carried the highest tariffs. They range, it could be, 5, 6, 7% up to the 30s. Same with footwear. So as a result, those were considered a revenue risk for CBP. And remember, even before that, there were textile quotas, absolute quotas, where after a certain quantity came through from certain countries like China, they absolutely could not come into the United States under quotas. So they were traditionally considered risky. They are sensitive commodities. Now, of course, with the other tariffs, they kind of don't stick out as much, but they still are considered risky because of their base tariffs that are high and now the additional tariffs that are on top of them.
There's also a high counterfeit risk.
True.
The fraud and counterfeit risk on textiles is extremely high, and harder to spot.
Yeah,
Yes.
good point. Lenny, how is CBP combating DDP shipments that are undervaluing commercial invoices?
Yeah.
And, has a census warning been removed?
Yeah, I mean, remember those census warnings are still going to be there if you are not within the parameters, the valuation parameters for certain commodities. That's important to recognize. Now, some of these are legitimate, and maybe the values might be appropriately lowered from what you might see if you're not in a DDP situation. Again, if we're talking a non-resident importer or a party who might be reflective of a wholesale as opposed to a retail price. Those are all possibilities. But what we're seeing is a real uptick in requests for information, 28s and notices of action, 29, that are asking about value. They are asking these questions. So I think we're going to see CBP continue to do that and maybe open up investigations if they really feel that there was a pattern of undervaluation that led to a loss of revenue.
Next question. Do we need a new POA when a customer has an address change? There's nothing in the handbook that addresses it.
It would be good to have it. I mean, I think you guys would go ahead, Eric. Were you going to say something?
Sorry, no, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I don't know that it's absolutely required, but Customs does assume that you're updating a POA with any revisions. So I would fault on the side of, I would definitely submit a new POA.
So it's not, I wouldn't say that it was required, but if you are able to get the new POA, I agree. I would like you to do that and get it updated. I think that's important. I think it's good just for you to do an update on the POAs, generally speaking, and try to make sure they're accurate. Sometimes an Inc. Or an S Corp becomes an LLC and you didn't correct that, and that's going to be a problem. It's okay if the person who signed it, might no longer be there, but I'd rather have you have the POA signed by somebody who is at least there now at this point. But again, we understand that people are going to come and go, and that's understandable if they had that authority at the time. And the NCBFA just updated our powers of attorney about 3 years ago. So probably if you're have some old POAs there that have been around over that time, they don't have all those good updates in them. So it's just something I think I'd want you to consider, even if it's just an address change. But again, you don't necessarily have to.
Yeah, same thing with terms and conditions of service, if I can add that.
Exactly. Thank you.
The latest versions of these are good. And this is just part of the continuous, vetting process too, so.
Exactly.
okay, maybe I could start, Eric, with you. How do you find out the importer has prior regulatory and compliance violations?
I mean, I'll start with CBP. You know, again, it's not all just out there, but there are, you know, there's the trade intelligence, there's databases like ACE and you know, there's just industry and trade associations. You can talk to people. I mean, ask them. You know, honestly, that sounds like it's not an answer, but it is. Ask them. If they're again, this is going to lead you right back to those behavioral indicators. If you ask them right flat out, hey, have you had, you know, this something, whatever, frame it however you want it, but have you had any prior issues? You know, has there anything gone on? We need to know. If they seem flighty about that answer, there you go. There's your red flag. So, you know, honestly, the best answer to that question is just ask them.
Agreed.
Good answer. Yes, love it. When it comes to financial risk, how would you determine or quote, raise the red flag when you see commercial invoice discrepancies? Are they intentional or clerical errors? If you see the same error multiple times or something else. Yeah, so I guess they're just asking, how do you pick up, how do you know when it's a true red flag versus just a clerical error?
I'm gonna borrow the answer, Eric, that we just gave before, which is
I think
ask
so.
them. That,
Right,
that I think, right. I think you just really have to inquire. I think it's a combination of inquiring and also I would do this if you have any importers that are bringing in similar merchandise from the same parts of the world. Does theirs stick out? Does theirs look different? Is there an anomaly? I think a lot of us just forget to use common sense and our years of experience and just say, well, I haven't seen an invoice really fashioned that way from that country, from that part of the world. So I'm wondering what's going on here. Or, oh, yeah, I see that mistake all the time. You know, we usually see and hear the same mistakes, or we see mistakes and errors which pop out as being really odd. Again, bananas from Norway.
Yeah. Okay. This is a little bit longer question, but do you have questions or do you have suggestions for verifications or validation of Canadian parties acting as an importer or record? For US parties, there are Secretary of State websites, Dun & Bradstreet, et cetera, but harder to find for Canadian companies.
I don't personally know any. If Lenny does, I don't know. I'm not real. I personally am not real big on the Canadian side of this our businesses, but I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Not licensed to practice in Canada, although it would be really cool if I could be. So I'm not going to go there. But I would. There's some really awesome. I'll say this. There's some really awesome, some really good customs and trade attorneys and consultants on the Canada side, and I'm sure they'd be happy to
Yeah.
get you that information. Or Karen probably knows them directly and could answer that question
Yes.
with their support, and they'll tell you where to go. I'm thinking probably the provinces, you know, each have something like that on record. That would be my thought, but I'll leave it to the Canadian experts to confirm or deny that.
Yeah. Yeah. The Canadian Society
Right.
of Custom Brokers can help us out to,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
answer that question for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, Eric, to you, is Roanoke following in the footsteps of CBP in an AI/MI adoption? Is there any automated vetting tool that the surety/CBP can provide to brokers?
It's funny, we just had a big webinar about AI earlier this morning, internally. And internally here at Roanoke, you know, I think this is still the budding time for AI. I mean, in a perfect world, yes, we'd have an AI, you know, we'd have to think of a catchy name for him. But we'd have an AI partner, and still we do not have that yet. You know, one day. But then again, you know, you have to think with AI, there is still that margin of error. And you know, how much faith do you want to put in that when these are, you know, as serious as they are and regulated and you know, actions. So I don't know. Everyone has their opinion on AI and you know, it certainly does make things easier, but it comes with a lot. So
Yeah, and Lenny, maybe you want to add to this too. My comments around that is it still needs vetting. So even if you do have an AI integration, you know, you shouldn't take it verbatim. It does
Right.
still require some checking.
Oh yeah, we're looking at that here in the firm too. You have to be very
Yeah.
careful with AI. It definitely, if you're trying to come up with like a snazzy title for a webinar fine. If you're right,
Yeah.
if you're trying to come up with a new advertising campaign for your business, okay. But I
Yeah.
mean, to start asking it like, do the Section 232 tariffs apply to this scenario? Or taking your client's information and putting it out in generative AI, you also have confidentiality issues, folks. So
Yes.
it starts, the issues
Right.
start piling up. So be very careful with how you use it. Be very thoughtful.
Okay, let's do one last question before we wrap up, because I think it's the last one here on the list. I have a client that cannot get an approval for a $1.5 million bond. They set up a couple of companies in different locations to import auto parts. Is that okay?
Well, okay, so I mean, the first thing they're not able to get the $1.5 million bond. I would assume that's financial based. More often than not, that's what's preventing them from getting the bond either. Well, it's probably been offered, but with collateral, I can probably assume. Collateral has kind of been the word of the year. That's a conversation that you have to have with your importer clients, and that's the collateral conversation. And if they're bringing in anything of any sort of volume where they're, superseding $100,000 bond, you certainly need to have that conversation, which is, I don't know how your financials look. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. If you don't know how they look, you started with that. It's none of your business, but be prepared to share those with the surety. I mean, the amount of importers who are kind of outright shocked that they have to submit financials for review is alarming. And it just as any financial institution, your financials need to be seen and need to be looked at, and if the surety is going to back you. So I would have that conversation earlier than later, especially if an importer is starting to increase their bond amounts. The companies in different locations, that's gonna eventually get you in trouble. I wouldn't recommend doing that.
Looks like there's an additional comment to that, Eric. They have
Yeah, I just got the
separate couple
separate
companies. Yeah, each one over
Yeah,
500,000.
that's a risky game. And Lenny can probably go into that for a while, but that's just a risky game to play. I don't know. It's going to catch up with you eventually. I mean, you're going to have to bite the bullet. If you need the bond size you need, that's the bond size you need. You're going to have to bite the bullet and address the collateral issue. You can shop the bond as if you want as the broker, you can try. But that's why I say if an importer looks as though they are going to increase their bond to a substantial amount, you need to talk about collateral and the chance that it may come into play.
Great. Well, with that, thank you, Eric. Thank you, Lenny, for presenting today. I appreciate it. And I thank you all for joining us today. Hope the session would provide practical takeaways you can apply to your importer onboarding and vetting process. A recording of today's webinar and additional resources will be sent to you shortly. Thanks again for your time. We appreciate you being a part of today's discussion. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
It's a pleasure.